they're analytical. Picking my nose, don't really know if I like that. Picking their brains, got different lanes, but I like that. Picking these guys, all of these times, all of these nice stats. Picking apart, the film isn't all.
Hey everyone, not feeling too well. Actually, I think I drank too much coffee. I've been experimenting with it the last few weeks. I live in America now, got to switch to coffee. Anyway, I think I drank too much. I got real jittery. So do what I do when I can't sleep or whatever. I decided to put the time to use. Man, I used to be so healthy. I had to go find my hat because the hair's getting insane at this point. So I'm making myself look a little more respectable here. God, I swear, I got to get stuff back in order, starting with my sleeping pattern. But in the meantime, I decided to put some use. Jacob Brickroad posted about Patrick Mahomes' touchdown influence 50 touchdown season, and how that was bound to regress next year. Now, that put me in mind to look at my red zone regression. Someone asked me about it a couple weeks ago, and I'm just so snowed in with stuff right now. I keep forgetting to get around to stuff, so I thought I'd take a look. Patrick Mahomes' total touchdown volume is the highest I've ever seen, like over expected in terms of touchdowns in the red zone. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the red zone database that I've got available through the link that only Patreons have. I forget which one it is, but there's one I only share with Patreons, which has got a link to a couple of extra sheets, including the red zone database. I'll post it again if no one can find it. So I thought I'd talk about what that is, and then show you a little bit about in each aspect of the game, receiving, rushing, and passing, the top 10 seasons in terms of overproducing in touchdowns, and what happened to them the next year, and then take a look at 2018 and who was overproducing at a similar rate, so should regress downwards. In fact, there's no such thing as downwards regression, but regress back to the mean in 2019, right? So a little bit of expectation. I really appreciate everyone commenting on the poll I put up there. Well, I got a few comments, I got a few votes about whether I should do regular videos. This isn't any of the suggestions so far. This is just something that came up, and I thought, well, I couldn't sleep, wasn't feeling well. I'd try and put the time to use, and this is what came up. So, just briefly, if I can use that as an introduction and start a new section here. Red zone expected value. It's something that TJ Hernandez did, or at least showed me how to do a couple years ago. He's got it on his roster coach videos, which I think are now behind the paywall, but I learned it before that, so I know how to do it. All it is calculating how many fantasy points players scored inside the red zone at different depths, and then looking at the average player's touchdown total at those different yard lines. So what I do is that you look at the inside the 20-yard line of the opponent's 20-yard line. So when you're in the red zone, if you throw a pass inside the 20, between 20 and 15 yards, how often does that turn into fantasy points? And then you find out the average fantasy points for one throw at that distance, and then you break it down between the 15 and the 10, and then the 10 and the 5 and the 5 and the 1. And so you're not just getting expected value inside the 20, but you're getting it at each depth, because as you get closer, it gets easier to rush, catch, or throw for a touchdown, and so they should all have a little expected value. And so it's really quite delicate. It's intricate, maybe is a word, or exact is better, in terms of based on the average, and some players have a higher or lower average just as red, like Devontae Adams. Julio Jones has a naturally low one. We know he doesn't score a lot of red zone touchdowns. Devontae Adams has always, when he's scored at least, overproduced in touchdowns. Keenan Allen has always been typically below the average. That doesn't mean he's always due to regress upwards to the mean. His average just might be slightly lower than most because of the way he plays or the way his team uses him. So the average isn't as exact for every player, but it does give us a pretty decent idea. The other thing I like about it is, one, that it breaks it down by yard line, so it's that specific, but also excuse me, it breaks it down in the passing, receiving, and rushing game. And so you can really look at it based on a historical average in terms of fantasy points. So not just expected value like a success rate model, which can be a little hard to translate into points for your fantasy team, but this specifically calculates how many fantasy points they scored in touchdowns and should have scored in touchdowns. And I think that makes it instantly relatable to fantasy, right? If you're looking at a fantasy point number, it's much easier to understand than some kind of percentage of success, or I think so anyway. So in my red zone database, what I include is not just overall how many targets or how many rushing attempts they had at each of the thresholds, whether it was between the 20 and 16, 15 and 11, 10 and 6, or 5 and 1, and I do it for passing, rushing, and touchdown, but also how many points they actually scored, literal fantasy points they scored with those touches, and then the EV is how many fantasy points they should have scored. So on average, how many fantasy points did that amount of touches at those depths actually turn into? So hopefully it's pretty easy. Again, where it's fantasy points, I think it's a little easy to understand. And I also sum it. So sum red zone EV, and that's what that RZEV stands for, is if you add the EV, how far over or under the expected value of those touches they were in the passing, rushing, and receiving game together. So it's just adding all three values together. Sorry, my beard seems to be itchy as hell tonight. So sum EV is exactly that, and just by sorting by sum EV, you can see the most inflated touchdown seasons that have happened since 2014. I've really got to push this back beyond 2014. I've only been collecting it since 2017, and I've pushed it back a couple of years. I really want to go back further than that, but so far that's as far as I've gone. So you can see Cam Newton's season in 2015 was the heaviest total red zone expected value over expected. So he scored more points over the average than anyone else since 2014, just inside the red zone in touchdowns. And that kind of makes sense because he's doing it in the rushing game and in the passing game, and he had an insanely high touchdown rate in both, and so that makes him the most excessive in terms of the average. Now, interesting enough, Pat Mahomes' season, while it's famed now as one of the highest passing touchdown seasons in terms of producing more fantasy points per touch in the red zone, it's actually only the third highest since 2014. Aaron Rodgers' 2016 was just slightly over what Patrick Mahomes did. So he was overproducing in the red zone by one extra fantasy point in 2016. And again, if you look along, you can see where all that comes from. So if we skip over to the passing game here, you can see he threw the ball 35 times inside between the 20 and the 16, and he got 3 touchdowns off of that. He got 11 touchdowns between the 10 and the 6 after throwing it only 24 times. And again, that all results in, he should have scored... he should have scored 100 points. He actually scored 132, which gives him 31 points over the average of what those touches typically produce. Again, that's Aaron Rodgers and Cam Newton, so they're mostly explainable. But what I was interested in, especially with touchdowns where they're mostly random, and we're always talking about the regression next year, is what happened the year after that. Did they actually regress? Now, this is a little tricky because I think Cam Newton played less than 16 games the next year, for example, and Aaron Rodgers may have as well. We could check it out, dig in a little further. But when I looked at the sum totals, I found in the top 10 seasons, all of them regressed the next year. Like Cam Newton went from scoring 35 total touchdowns in 2015 to 16 the next year. Aaron Rodgers went from 37 to 12. So they probably were hundreds for some of these years, if memory serves. Tyler Eifert definitely was. Tom Brady wasn't. And they still regressed down 11 total touchdowns. Now, total is interesting to look at overall. But, not all of these names are going to be entirely familiar. We're not going to remember the seasons exactly. So I wanted to look at, just in terms of receiving touchdowns, rushing touchdowns, and passing touchdowns, who overproduced and underproduced in the last 4 or 5 years, and then look at 2018. And so what I did is sort of exactly that. And I've taken pictures to make this a little easier than me clicking through the sheet. Hopefully this is visible. But what you can see here is the top 10 seasons for wide receivers in the receiving game. So this is the 10 most overproducing seasons inside the red zone for wide receivers since 2014. Allen Robinson's 2015 was the highest receiving touchdown overproduction that we've seen since 2014. What I also did is I looked up how many receiving touchdowns they got the year after, the same way I did with total touchdowns. And Allen Robinson went from 12 down to 6. Torrey Smith was the second highest and went from 7 down to 1 touchdown the next season. And again, I'm not factoring in injuries here, so some of this has to be a little contextual. But all of the top 10 seasons for wide receivers in the receiving game, they had significantly fewer touchdowns the next year. What I've taken out from looking at the whole sample is that if a player is over 20, like 20 fantasy points over expected, they're pretty much always going to regress in the number of touchdowns. Now, the thing with regression in general is that volume is the cure for everything. Like, you get a lot more passes or a lot more rushing attempts or a lot more receptions, then your touchdown percentage can drop and you still score significantly high in terms of fantasy points and in terms of touchdowns, because you are scoring at a slower rate, but you're getting more volume, and therefore these numbers will drop. You're no longer overproducing at that point. So if a player gets more volume, then regression is certainly less of a concern. So we have to factor that in. So looking at wide receivers in 2018, who overproduced, were any of them close to that 20 fantasy points over expected that we should be worried about in 2019? That's what this picture here is. Davante Adams, who I said always has he scores more of his points through touchdowns than most of the receivers. So his average should be a little higher. Now, he actually produced over 40 points over expected. So 40 fantasy points of his fantastic, and he never scored below 15 fantasy points in a single week. So we already know he was riding high in 2018. But he scored 40 points, which was actually 40 points over the expected. So based on where he got his touches in the red zone and just his receptions, he actually scored 40 more points than he should have. That's high even for Adams. So he won't continue that touchdown efficiency. I know everyone's focused on Mahomes, but in Green Bay, Davante Adams has a touchdown problem, even at his higher than average rate. He's going to need a lot more volume, or he's going to have to score touchdowns outside of the red zone, so longer plays, more often in 2019 in order to produce the same way he did in 2018. Now, I think he's still going to be good. He's obviously still a wide receiver 1, but we should definitely expect a lower touchdown rate than he had in 2018. Dron Brown is an interesting name to come up from last season. He scored 5 touchdowns. I didn't even know that. All of them were in the red zone, and that was significantly above the average. He shouldn't have had a 100% touchdown rate, right? That makes sense. Calvin Ridley is probably a name you already know. It's definitely very close to that danger line of 20 points. I would expect his touchdown rate to drop in 2019. He's going to need more volume. And with Julio Jones there, that's going to be difficult. I've already given up. I was wrong. Calvin Ridley was good. That question I had about what he would have done younger, it was answered. He's a good player. However, he still is second to Julio Jones and will be for the significant future. And he's going to need more volume to continue his fantasy points. So I actually expect him to drop. He is at a high risk of dropping outside of the top 24. We shouldn't stop valuing him as a top 24 wide receiver. He's young, he's good, he's on an effective offense. But unless that offense gets a lot more successful, has a lot more red zone touchdowns, and he gets a lot of them, his touchdown rate's going to drop, and so his fantasy points significantly because of that. He just scored too many touchdowns. Tyler Boyd is interesting because he had the same number of touchdowns in the red zone and scored similar numbers to Calvin Ridley. I don't think when thinking about 2018, we think that Tyler Boyd was overproducing in the red zone with touchdowns as much as Calvin Ridley. I don't think most people know that. And I'm a really big fan of Tyler Boyd, but unless he gets more volume, and with a healthy AJ Green, that might be difficult. Tyler Boyd's also going to struggle to continue those numbers. And remember, AJ Green missed several weeks, which was when Tyler Boyd's volume actually dipped a little bit, but he still became number 1. And I imagine that's where he got a lot of those red zone targets. So it takes more looking into. I'm not giving up on Boyd at all. but he's going to need more volume somewhere on the field or in the red zone to produce at the same touchdown rate or same number of touchdowns at a lower touchdown rate in 2019. Kenny Stills isn't a concern because no one really cares about him. Mike Williams is the other one that really sticks out on this list. He was heavily touchdown influenced, and where Keenan Allen sucks up so many targets, and he's going to continue. It's like the Julio Jones situation, but Keenan Allen's younger. I've seen a lot of people rushing to get Michael Williams. He's a good player. I actually like him a lot. I think he's finally recovered from some of his injuries. He got a chance to show what he could do inside the breakout threshold. I expect him to continue to be fantasy relevant. But top 24 receiver will be difficult without getting a lot more volume because of these touchdown numbers. All right, so Keenan Allen actually overproduced his touches in the red zone, which is interesting but not significantly, not to the respect they would say he's definitely going to regress next season. But that's interesting for a player that typically has a lower touchdown rate. So maybe some regression because of that. All right, how long have I been recording? I didn't realize I had so much to say about this. 16 minutes. I'm going to rush through the other ones. How's that? Which should be easy. Running backs, there's not a lot of interesting names. Like, no one cares that Crowell, Forsett, and were the highest producers over average in touchdowns in 2014. Probably not something I remember from 2014, given everything that was happening there. But it is interesting to note that running backs too, based on the next year in the red zone, their rushing attempts, they did see significantly fewer touchdowns the next year if they overproduced. I'd say the danger number here is about 20 fantasy points as well. Again, having looked at the whole sample a little more in depth, if you're 20 fantasy points over expected, you're probably going to get less touchdowns. Now, David Johnson is an interesting example, if you can see this picture here, in that he overproduced in touchdowns in 2015 when he only really played towards the end of that season when Andre Allen was hurt, if we remember. But the next year, he actually produced twice as many touchdowns. But we also know that's the year that he took over that backfield. So he got a lot more touches. And his red zone expectation actually fell. He wasn't overproducing in the average. He actually fell right in line with the average expectation for touchdown points the next year. So that's why he sees that it's this exception. He overproduced and then he scored more touchdowns. That's unusual. But it does mean I'm a little more scared of saying that 17 fantasy points over expected is a guaranteed regression or more guaranteed regression. I want something a little higher than that. So let's look at 2018. Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon. I rechecked this because Todd Gurley came up as overproducing in 2017 and I was wrong. I had the number slightly wrong, but I double checked him for 2018. Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon, Aaron Jones, and Alex Collins. Not that anyone's caring to draft him anymore. They definitely overproduced in touchdowns on rushing attempts in the red zone. So they'll need more rushing attempts or they'll need touchdowns some other way to keep up this same level of volume. Royce Freeman also overproduced, but that makes sense given where he was getting touches and the fact Philip Lindsay was dominating the backfield. He was brought in more in that role. David Johnson again turns up on the list. Last year, despite all the troubles he had, David Johnson was very efficient with his touches in the red zone. I think that's more of a positive sign, and you could say that for James Conner as well, especially with someone with a less of a history of being elite. Conner was very efficient with his rushing attempts in the red zone. In the passing game, as we know, we're going to say that Patrick Mahomes is due regression, but is there anyone else? Well, looking at the historical top 10 seasons, you can see that number is slightly elevated for quarterbacks. I'd say 30 points or more in passing touchdowns over expected is the danger number for the passing game. So again, you can look at these numbers. I'll post the pictures too. But for 2018, the quarterbacks that stick out, they were overproducing. Patrick Mahomes, we know, yes, he produced 50 points more than he should have just inside the red zone. And we know there are a lot of deep passing attempts that overproduced touchdowns as well. More volume would be difficult to predict from Mahomes. We do expect touchdown regression, but maybe he has a higher than normal average. But even then, he's not going to get his 50 touchdowns or his 33 touchdowns in the red zone in 2019. Russell Wilson, I don't think that's going to surprise anyone either, who's incredibly efficient in 2018, and in the red zone that followed through as well. Andrew Luck might be not be a name that occurs to you immediately, but in the red zone he was incredibly efficient, scored a lot of touchdowns over the average touchdown rate. Now the one thing I'd say about Andrew Luck, who I really like, I had him as a top 5 running back. Nope, quarterback. I'm sick, guys. Give me a break. When everyone was dropping him outside of the top 12. Like, I don't think anyone can doubt my Andrew Luck trutherism. I think his value shot back up. It's where it should be. I will not be buying Andrew Luck right now, especially since, again, need more volume. And it's really difficult to think that they had a high passing volume last year. I don't think that's going to increase in 2019. And there are a lot of short passes as well. So he's going to start needing to bring back his deep ball a little bit more in order to produce touchdowns at any kind of similar volume or amount that he did last season. Mayfield, he only played a partial season, so we can probably give him a pass. But he was incredibly efficient, which is both good and bad when you're thinking about regression. Cam Newton, again, just seems to feature on these lists a lot. He's efficient with his touchdowns. And this is just the passing game, remember. So this is taking the rushing game out. So maybe at 22, I'm not particularly worried based on those top 10 seasons. 22 is below that almost kind of guaranteed, that was a weird face, area where they're going to regress, but still, it's a name I'll remember. Everyone else on this list from 2018, I will say, was just efficient. I don't think we need to worry too much about regression, although without significant volume, maybe it will happen. But again, the names that stick out to me on the quarterbacks list are Mayfield. He's probably going to get more volume, though. Andrew Luck is the one that really concerns me. I think we already knew about Mahomes and Wilson. Again, to remind us of the running backs, Gurley and Gordon, they feature a lot when you look back. They're always kind of over average in their efficiency in the red zone. But Aaron Jones, Kamara, they're a little more worrying. I don't think they can get more volume, and they were way too efficient last year to continue that in 2019. But maybe they'll catch more passes in the receiving game, to be fair. And in the receiving game, Adams, he can't, even he, with his level of touchdown efficiency, probably isn't going to keep that up. He's going to need fantasy points some other way. I don't think he can get any more volume than he's already got in the red zone last year. Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd and Mike Williams, I said, were the concerning ones in the receiving game. All right. Again, I'll post those pictures so you can look at them more closely. The Red Zone database is already available to Patreon, so you can explore that at your leisure. The one thing I didn't put in the Red Zone database, and I guess I can include it in the future, but is what they did next year. Like, you can see how many touchdowns they scored and then how many touchdowns they scored the next year. Hopefully, you already know now that overproducing in touchdowns is pretty definitely an indication you're going to score fewer touchdowns the next season. That almost always happens, especially when you're producing, again, over 20 or over 30 fantasy points over expected for quarterbacks in the passing game. Those thresholds seem to be pretty definite. Again, that's only since 2014, but that's a pretty good sample in the way the game's being played right now, at least, because it has changed significantly. Then if we push it back too much further, we're going to be getting a different type of passing game, different type of rushing game started to be included in the sample. So I'm pretty happy with saying that touchdowns do regress pretty consistently if they're overproducing in terms of red zone expected value. Whew. Okay. Actually do feel a little better now. That was fun. Okay. Hopefully that's of interest to you. I know everyone's thinking about rookies, but that's not a terrible time to start looking at something else, especially while making trades. We're yet to get the most important information for rookies. I do intend to do a video of, lesser known rookies that I think are lesser known that I am interested in. But this is what I had to do tonight. I just had that feeling, guys. Guys and girls, sorry. All right, I'm gonna jet out of here and see if I can sleep for a while. That will be nice. I hope you have a good day. Hope this video finds you well. Again, appreciate you all. Thanks very much, and I will talk to you again next time I find the time to make a video, I guess. Thank you. Bye.